All right, very good. All right, so for Open Farm Days, as I mentioned, we have never had any issues with activism, but what we'd like to do is have one little tool in our toolbox so that you know how to respond if something strange does happen to happen. Um, Everyone should have their access for the Open Farm Days host. And if you don't, please let us know. You can throw it into the comments or his chat section. But when you register for Open Farm Days, we have our updated host information for this year. And in the host resource, there's something called the Farm Emergency Plan. And this is a national document. And what it is really is kind of a checklist of what you should do if something happens. And it also kind of prompts you to get all the appropriate phone numbers and things like that. So that includes everything from fire safety, accidents for vehicles, chemical spills, and things like that. What's for Open Farm Days, what we strongly recommend is that you have this filled out, but that you also have this available for everyone that's working on your farm. So whether it's volunteers, somebody that's working at the check-in desk or at the front, so that if something goes wrong, everyone knows who they should be contacting instead of running around trying to find you. So one of those kind of important things. So you can find this action plan on our website. As I mentioned, there's also a bunch of national sites that have it. This has fillable boxes and things, so you can go in and find it and fill it out. Page 16 is the page that is kind of relevant for us for today. And that is essentially just a fill-in form that gives you all the buckets of here's the phone numbers for an ambulance, for gas, for power, for police, RCMP, those sorts of things. And it's one of those things that if something goes wrong, it's great to have that information right at your fingertips instead of panicking and thinking, oh my gosh, who should I be calling in this kind of scenario? So today we're going to be talking about activism as it relates to that. So there's one specific bucket. When we have unwanted guests anywhere, as a business owner and as a landowner, you have rights. And we've been talking to the RCMP and a couple of different offices just to get some clarification, some different opinions on what should be done. But essentially for Open Farm Days, you're opening your doors to allow people to come in. And so you are effectively open as a business. And if somebody is there for a purpose other than what you're trying to do, which is to have your business run, there's a couple of steps. So it's pretty much 5 simple ones. The first one is really to clarify the purpose of their visit. If it seems like someone is there to cause trouble, you probably might think that you know what that is, but we ask you really to clarify first. There could be a communication error, could be something else that's going on. So double check, what are you here for today? And once you've got that answer, you kind of know which way to start to proceed. If they are being disruptive, let them know that you're being disruptive to your business and you ask them to leave. What you want to do next is let them know that by staying, they are now effectively trespassing. And if they continue to stay there, they actually can be charged under something called the Petty Trespassing Act. And we'll get into that in the next slide. And your next step is to call the RCMP. So it's pretty straightforward. Why are you here? You're causing problems. Please go. You will be charged with trespassing, and call the RCMP. So it's 5 simple steps. Now, next slide.
It's being tricky with me. Sorry. There we go.
That's okay. So once we will be sending this presentation out, so there is a live link in here. And what you can do is you can find out what region you're in using the map here that's on the left-hand side. And the link to find a detachment in Alberta will find your closest town. You just click on the link and you'll get the contact information for it. So it's pretty straightforward. And I will say, having called a number of the different detachments, they're very, very willing to kind of talk to you, answer any questions and stuff that you might have. So I suggest, having some sort of relationship or reaching out is never a bad thing, just to know. Next slide, Nicola. All right, so a little bit about the Petty Trespassing Act. We will be putting a copy of this onto the host resources as well, so you'll be able to download it there. You can also go onto the Government of Alberta website where you will find a copy of this as well. The important bits though, no person shall enter onto land without the permission of the owner or the occupier. So it doesn't matter if you own the land or if you're leasing the land. If they don't have your permission to be there, then basically they're trespassing. A couple of the examples the RCMP were using was there's some people that might be there under they might have access to the land for certain reasons, like let's say a mail carrier is allowed to come on to make a delivery, but if they're doing something other than the purpose of what they came for, then that becomes trespassing. So you're holding an educational event. If somebody hasn't come to learn, then essentially they're not there for the reason that that they're supposed to be there for. So they are in fact trespassing. So you just ask them to leave. Knowing a little bit about the Trespassing Act is probably a good thing, but somebody who contravenes the act, they can actually have a first fine of up to $10,000 and up to 6 months in imprisonment. So knowing a little bit about that can also be a bit of a deterrent, and letting them know that you know what it is. I think some people, again, we've never had any problems, but because we have an open house, people think, well, I'm allowed to be here. Actually, no one is allowed to be on your land without your approval or permission. It doesn't matter that you're open for open farm days. If they're not there and if you ask them to leave, it's your land. So they have absolutely no rights whatsoever. And I think that part is pretty straightforward. The next thing is we're going to talk a little bit about two things. And this brings me to the first question, which is asking, why are they there? There's two different things. There's a big difference between animal rights and animal welfare. And it's generally issues around animals that cause some of the big problems. Having said that, though, nosy neighbors, different things, people have all sorts of problems with all sorts of people. So even if it's not around activism or something, knowing that somebody trespassing that you don't want on your land, you can ask them to leave under those things. But when we start to get into animal rights and animal welfare, there's a little bit of a difference between the two. And there are some things that you can solve and there's some things that you can't solve. And I will say, I think animal rights started very interesting examples. So in North America, in 1866, there was a carriage driver and a horse, and the horse had fallen down and somebody was beating the horse and somebody stepped in, and that was actually the start 2 years later of the SPCA, which was just about protecting animals. So for animal welfare, animals have a right to food, water, shelter, and veterinary care. So people that care about animals want to make sure that those things are kind of taken care of. And a lot of times when you're dealing with people from the cities, there may be a lack of information about how animals, what they need, what kind of conditions they can live in and what suits them. So I think that's really important to know. And, in the rise of TikTok and stuff, I will say I have a husky, and Nicola and I were chatting about this earlier, but, you laugh at all the people that have their, outdoor dogs outdoors, and people are horrified, not recognizing that's where they want to be. So that is a lack of education. And there is the opportunity to educate people and explain what, why, and how. Animal rights on the left-hand side. So those organizations like PETA, which is the Protection for Ethical Treatment of Animals. Those are arguments and discussions that you will never win. When we take a look at the extreme ends of animal rights, there are groups that believe that animals should not be used for entertainment. So that would be the protests that you'd see at things like Calgary Stampede and rodeos. They also, some extreme groups believe animals should not be kept as pets, obviously not as food. So those are arguments and discussions you'll never win. If somebody is there and that's a conversation they want to have, there's no point in engaging with them. You ask them to leave and you call the RCMP. So understanding the difference between educating people that don't understand that the animals there are healthy, they're being well cared for because that's part of your livelihood. Those people can be educated. On the left-hand side, those people cannot. So you just want them to leave. So we're going to talk a little bit about different kind of protests. In Canada, we haven't seen too many of them. And I've done a bit of a deep dive into what we've had in Canada. And we've had a few. We've had one in Alberta on a turkey farm. There was one in the last couple of years in British Columbia on a pig farm, and there was another one in Ontario. But these are very few and far between, and these are not types of farms like our open for open farm days. Typically, these sorts of places are places that people cannot get into. So by virtue of the fact for open farm days, everyone's opening their gates. This is not the type of target. It does exist out there. But what we see, there's sort of three different things. People actually will interview and get a job so that they can get inside a farm or a facility, so they can plant cameras. Their goal is basically to get footage or proof that something bad is happening, and staging demonstrations and protests. Again, nothing that we expect to have for open farm days. It doesn't mean as the program continues to grow that we might not in the future have some sort of problem. We don't expect to, but the impact of this is anytime somebody protests, even if you're in the clear and have done nothing wrong, you can actually be vilified in the media. So a great example was the pig farm that was in British Columbia, and somebody had planted a spy camera and then went to the authorities with it and went to the media, and they had called the regulatory bodies, and they came out and they said, you know what, these guys are best in class. Their conditions are perfect, and this is what we want to see. There's a few minor little things that they made adjustments for. But the problem was going back to those first slides where the general public doesn't always understand. So that education piece, which is what Open Farm Days is about, is really, really important. So when we take a look at these things, I think what's really important to know is, as a landowner, you have the rights to have anyone that's on your property leave. It's important for you to know it is a trespassing act, and then to phone the RCMP, and don't engage with the protesters. It's just, you're what you want to do is just basically have that plan for them to go away. And we're going to move on to the last slide, which I'll hand over to Nicola, because from a social media perspective, how you handle these sorts of things becomes very important. And this is some of the part that kind of hangs around afterwards. So Nicola, over to you.
Yeah. So the very first thing that you need to do, because this, is very frustrating. You might find it kind of triggering, like this is not what I'm supposed to do, but different people communicate in different ways. So the absolute very first thing that you need to do, rather than, letting it take over your brain, is to take a step back, take a breath. And sometimes, like the old adage goes, to sleep on it and then respond to it the next day. And the other reason is that considering the source, because, and that's the part where taking the time to think about it is really helpful. Is this an anti-ag group, or is this a neighbor that's being nosy, or is this someone in the community that, might have a valid response because they're not educated on what's going on? So very first thing that you need to be doing, and this goes from even a social media or a media point of view, is just taking a deep breath, sleeping on it, consider the source. Is this a valid type of, protest? And then go from there. If this is an anti-ag group like PETA or something like that, as Tanis mentioned, just do not engage. Just really not worth it, right? Call the RCMP if you need to and go forward. If this is someone that's come to your farm and maybe they don't understand agriculture, and again, this is what Open Farm Days is to create these educational experiences. So whether someone's made a snide remark, or they're complaining about, way that the chicken coop is set up or what have you, this is your point of where you educate and you change the conversation and you connect on values. Like, yeah, I can understand that you would think that this chicken coop is X, but did you know that chickens like this a certain way? Or we go back to the dog piece as well. Like, don't we all love our dogs? You know, our pets are our life. But actually our Malamutes prefer to stay outside, even if it's -30, they're quite happy. Did you know they have 2 layers of fur that keeps them really warm, and they don't really like being inside. So those pieces are really important, because again, we want that educational piece, and we want to change the conversation and connect. You know, if they're complaining about such as, you know, well, the personal example, the dog, but also we've got here picking weeds over thousands of acres isn't feasible on a large scale. So again, it's that education piece, it's that connection piece. Can they visualize it? You know, they might have a solution, which is maybe ladybugs. Ladybugs are great, but to get rid of aphids or whatever. But can we do this over hundreds of acres of land? Like, no, that's not going to happen. So this is why we have to use herbicides and et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly, show that you care. I've never met a farmer or rancher who didn't care about their animals. And so having that open and transparent conversation will amplify your level of care. So again, that personal connection, telling a personal story, you know, connecting on values is really important. And then going back to the source. So is this an anti-ag group, or is this someone, you know, a nosy neighbor or someone who has no experience in agriculture before? And this is our opportunity to educate them. I know that we've seen some of this with our dairy farms, where they've, you know, people coming in with the hormone examples, and they're like, well, actually, no, this is how dairy works in Alberta, and this is how dairy works in Canada, and then being able to give that educational response. I will give you an example of how things can go wrong. If things do go wrong on social media, you are under no obligation to make a statement. You are under no obligation to make a statement to media. You know, there have been cases this summer where things made national news, but you do not need to talk to media. Like, I know sometimes you feel like if the TV calls, the radio calls, and you know they're under deadline, and it would be really, you know, you want to be helpful and get that story across. But sometimes, you know, when you're working in crisis communications, no communication is the best. So when they say no comment, that's fine. The news cycle moves fast. The news is just trying to provide context of what's happening in the environment right now. But usually something else will come up in 3 days and your story will be old news. Now, there are examples where that could be different, and that's where you would have to hire, you know, a crisis comms team or something like that. But, you know, again, for open farm days, we're small producers, we're not big producers. You know, nothing that we do hopefully would have any impact on that. So oftentimes it's just taking a deep breath, you know, sleep on it, and then consider the source. Is this worth me making you know, an impact on, or do I just ignore it and let it go, or do I take this opportunity to educate?
Now, I know we've got a few people here, so I'm curious, has anyone ever had any problems with guests at all, whether it be open farm days or just through the regular course of your business, of people that were problematic? I'll just ask you to unmute yourself, if anyone has.
No, kind of wait for a moment. This summer, I actually had a customer find a starling trap, and she was the kind that were feeding sparrows in Calgary. And so she was just absolutely incensed that when we explained to her that they were a problem bird, but it's a little bit like you said, no amount of talking is going to change her mind. She was convinced that all God's creatures should carry on and eat your crop. So anyways, it was a stalemate. I left her with Dave.
Poor Dave.
Yeah, poor Dave.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, well, and thank you for sharing that, because I think it's really important to realize that there are those ones that you are not going to win. It doesn't matter what you say. Their opinions are very different, and there is a lack of understanding. And then there's also an unwillingness to see a different side of it because they've decided it is morally wrong.
You know, when I look at your points though, I was busy, so I just left her with Dave. But really, part of what could have been said is that when we clean our bird boxes out in the fall, you will find swallows, which are the good guys, in my opinion, or bluebirds, and they've got holes pecked in them, and that's sparrows. So they, you know, that's our experience. We have seen them where they're not nice guys. They're not nice birds.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, and that becomes some of that education point. So when you think you've got some points, so you can say, hey, actually, they're kind of, you know, not the friendliest birds, and here's what's happening. That might surprise some people and recognize some of those aspects of it. I thought it was really interesting when I was talking to the RCMP and just saying, okay, so, you know, if I've got somebody and they're either disruptive, making you feel uncomfortable or whatever it is, they're like, yep, Petty Trespassing Act, just call the RCMP. Now, the reality is it's going to take them a while to get there. We understand that in rural Alberta. And if there's no imminent threat, that's a problem. Like, they're not going to be removed right away. However, understanding that that act exists is sort of, and how you can use it, empowers a little bit to say, tell you what, I'm asking you to leave. And now under the Petty Trespassing Act, and I will call the RCMP, and then you're subject to a fine. So, you know, your call. But, you know, I think that wee bit of knowledge of knowing that's out there and how it can be used, I think can be a powerful tool for some of them. It won't deter everybody. But I really think for Open Farm Days, I can't see that, but, you know, I think it's that opportunity to educate and then to remove. Great. Does anyone else have anything that they've come across that has been problematic? No?
And I think it would be helpful to cultivate the RCMP, right? Because I was at the Trochu Arboretum, and there was like, how many? 7 of them. There was a huge contingency there, and they were aware of our business, and they told me they were stopping for breakfast, and I said, right on, stop for breakfast. That would be good. So I think probably breakfast on the house for the Mounties. Okay. You don't mind them hanging at your place, right?
Oh, absolutely. And as I say, I called a number of different detachments just to find out if they had different advice or if I was seeing different information. And they were all quite happy to have the conversation and to talk about, yeah, nope, that's your land. And if there's someone there you don't want, you know, use this and call the RCMP. So they were very supportive of using this as a vehicle to remove those people. Heather, I saw you turn your camera on. Did you have a question?
No, not really. At the ranch, we haven't, knock on wood, we haven't really ever had an issue because it's kind of off the beaten path, but we have had issues at Stampede in particular.
Yes.
With general public coming up and saying, what is veterinary medicine doing at the Stampede? You have no business being here. And our common response is just that all animals deserve veterinary care and all animals deserve care. And that's pretty much, I mean, no one can really, if they start to argue with you about that, then, I mean, that's something we can't even fix, but all animals deserve care. And that's been our common answer. So that's all I wanted to share.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, when we're talking about animal welfare, it's that they're, you know, entitled to clean drinking water and food and shelter and veterinary care. And that's just the basics of what they're entitled to. Yeah. And I think too, I think really sometimes reinforcing that, like, really there's no one that cares more about the animals than the farmers. You know, it's, you know, sometimes you've got a lot of people that are sort of high and mighty on their feelings about things, but they have no idea what they're speaking about. So it's, you know, when you start to hear all the stories about farmers that are up in the middle of the night because something has gone wrong and they're, you know, doing everything they can, like that's the side that people don't see. So I think for Nicola's points of how people can connect under those, you know, those value systems, people can understand when they hear some of those stories. So it's, you know, that great opportunity. And as I said, we don't expect any problems for Open Farm Days, and we've never had any. But we just sort of felt is probably good for people to know just simply what to do and to have that emergency plan in place.
And the education piece too also can start. I mean, we've got Open Farm Days as a place for people to really, use the five senses to smell and touch and see, what farming is in Alberta. And so that educational piece is there, but it can start ahead of time there, whether it's on social media. I know a lot of farms like to do the day-to-day stuff so you can really see, like Tanis just said, it's 3 a.m. It's -40 outside. We just had a bunch of lambs we weren't expected. And then all of a sudden, everyone's bringing lambs into the house to keep them warm. And so telling those stories is a really important part of, gaining that audience, gaining that trust, but also that educational piece to help people understand agriculture in Alberta as well.
And just a quick question, because I can see with Grey Owl Meadery, Bar Estates, and of course you, Arden, have you had any problem also with the consumers that have maybe had a little more to consume than they should have, and any unruly behaviors?
We haven't had anything. Sorry, I apologize. We've been fortunate. We've never had any problems like that. No.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
I haven't had
Yeah,
problems. I've had people feel good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, all these sorts of businesses are not the typical ones that draw a problem crowd. So we don't really expect that. But sometimes people under the influence can be a little bit more emboldened than they might be otherwise. So wonderful. All right. Now, have all of you filled out your emergency plans before as well? Has anyone filled out their emergency plans before?
No.
The university operates on like a hazard assessment for us, so we use it all the time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I would strongly recommend that. It's just, it's a good little document. The whole rural emergency plan is 17 pages, but page 16 is really just that contact information page. So I would suggest that you go download it and just fill it out and have it posted at a couple of places. If anything should ever go wrong, is just comforting to know exactly who you should be calling at that time. So it is something that we are going to be kind of nudging on our farms on, just to make sure that they have it. And once you've done it once, it's good forever. You can make sure it's updated should anything change, but really, really good to have that in case of emergency. All right. Well, I think that wraps it up. If anyone's got any questions, let us know. We'll send out the presentation. The presentation has live links to the RCMP, to some articles and stuff as well. So feel free to kind of go through those. And as always, if you've got any questions, just fire them off our way, and we're happy to help you in your planning.
Thank you.